Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the president of AAPC and Emmons and Company, Dale Emmons.
Some hearty souls here this morning. There'll be a group gathering with us in a few minutes from upstairs in the tech conference that's going on, and there's 20 or so of them have been drinking Bloody Mary, so you'll probably be able to identify them when they walk in. I have a couple of announcements before we begin. I'd like to acknowledge that Eventbrite, who sponsored yesterday's board luncheon, and CBS Local Media, who sponsored last night's opening reception. We do appreciate their sponsorships and their support of the association. I want to remind you that on our website, theaapc.org, we have an online auction going on now. We hope you go on and take a look at the items that we're selling there. The funds and proceeds from that will go to our foundation to fund scholarships. Just to highlight the balance of today's agenda for you, to give you some perspective in case you don't have your program with you. 10:45, we have two sessions, The Changing World of Free Media and Politics and Sports, sponsored by Home Team Sports Division of Fox Sports. And at 2:15, Solutions Roundtables will be taking place. And then, of course, today at noon is our Hall of Fame luncheon, which all of you all will want to make sure you make. And we'll have this evening the women's networking opportunity, the reception that they're having, and we hope that you enjoyed today's program. This time I would like to invite our AAPC board chair, Whit Ayers, to kick off this morning's first panel.
Thank you, Dale, and welcome. Welcome to our first full day of panels. We are going to start off with one of the hotter topics, believe it or not, in 2012, and that is polling. It's not normally the subject of so much debate, but when you have folks sitting up whole websites calling it unskewedpolls.com, where people who never ever conducted a poll in their entire lives presumed to tell us what the real numbers were. Of course, they were flat wrong, but be that as it may. We thought we would open up our sessions today with four of the very best known pollsters anywhere in the country in their respective fields, and we're so glad you came. The moderator of our session today is the president of the Terrence Group, the man whose name sits right down here, and you will see at the Hall of Fame lunch today. And he will introduce the rest of our panelists. Please welcome Ed Goaz.
Thank you, guys. Why don't you come on out? I had said on setting up this panel that I wasn't going to say much. I'm just going to introduce everyone, kind of pose a question to each of the three, and then sit back and watch their presentations. To assure that, they made sure I didn't have a mic so that when I'm sitting down, I can kind of join in at all. So they're keeping me true to my word. Let me introduce the three. At my far left, your right, probably more appropriately, Bill McInturf, who's a partner and co-founder of Public Opinion Strategies. Public Opinion Strategies, we often call it POS, is a national political and public affairs survey research firm. Since its finding in 1991, the firm has completed more than 6 million interviews with voters and consumers in all 50 states and over a dozen foreign countries, and conducted more than 4,500 focus groups. Public Opinion Strategy currently represents 15 U.S. senators, 6 governors, and over 75 members of Congress. Bill, along with Peter Hart of Peter D. Hart Research Associates, conducts the NBC News, Wall Street Journal poll, and polling on economic trends for CNBC. Much of his work has been devoted to what he describes as combat message development, not simply monitoring public opinion, but developing messages to defend and promote client interest on complex policy issues. Most of Bill's focus in recent years has been on healthcare. He's conducted over 500 focus groups on healthcare over 200 national surveys on the topic alone. And one of the things I've always liked about Bill, we've worked together on and off, both against each other and with each other for 30 years now, is that he came into the business with hands-on experience, having worked in campaigns at the local, state, and national level, along with holding senior positions at the national committees before getting into polling and survey research. Joel Bennison is the founding partner and president of Bennison Research Strategy Group. Joel's in the center here. Joel is the only Democratic pollster in history to have notched 3 winning presidential campaigns. He's been the chief pollster and senior strategist for President Barack Obama since the beginning of his 2008 campaign, and also worked on Bill Clinton's 1996 race. As president and CEO of Bennison's Strategy Group, Joel has served as a strategic advisor and consultant to heads of state, members of Congress, and other national political leaders, along with Fortune 100 CEOs and major advocacy and charitable institutions. Some of the groups that I looked at that he's been involved with: AARP, SEIU, Clean Energy Works, and many of the largest businesses in the country: AOL, Campbell's, ESPN, just to be a few. Prior to becoming a pollster in 1995, Joel was a political journalist for the Daily News in New York and served as communication director for Governor Mario Cuomo's 1994 campaign. The one thing that I have seen, and that will be reflected in my question to him, he's known for his unique combination of communication expertise and aggressive analytical approach, producing winning messaging strategies in most challenging situations. And I would say one of the challenging situations was getting into the Obama campaign and the reelect. Scott Keeter, on my immediate left, is Director of Survey Research at Pew Center. As Director of Survey Research, Scott provides guidance to all the Pew Research Center's projects. His main appointment is in the Pew Research Center for People in the Press, where he plays a leading role in setting overall direction for the center and guiding its research. Scott helps design survey projects, develop questionnaire, and analyze the data. He's also the author of 4 books, Scott. If you go to our site in terms of the background, you can see many of those. He is past president of the American Association for Public Opinion Research, and since 1980, he's been an election night analyst and exit polls for NBC News, and has taught at George Mason University, Rutgers University, and Virginia Commonwealth University. So let me start it off, and I'll ask a question of Bill and let you kind of jump in. You saw the 2012 election from several different vantage points, numerous campaigns. Are there any lessons learned from 2012 that you're going to carry forward?
I guess I have something contradictory to say in a way, which is, number one, academics use the presidential race to say, is polling still accurate? And so I think, number one, I still feel very good and confident about the capacity of survey research to measure the electorate and measure the outcome. The day before the election, there were 7 surveys that were released. 4 of them had Obama had 1 to 3 points. 2 of them had tied, and then, of course, Gallup famously took their own data, which had Obama by 3, and then reweighted it to Romney +1 on their likely voter model. But in general, those polls and the internet polls, I think, were on the mark, and I think polling and I think telephone polling still has is still on and still has the capacity to work. The contradictory thing is that in some ways this is a cycle where the public polls outdid a lot of the partisan Republican polls. As someone who sits at that nexus, having done NBC Wall Street Journal and worked for a very large partisan pollster, I think you've got to be responsive to that. And I think some of the lessons that we've learned, I've written a report, it's on our website, kind of looking at the likely voter model, is number one, look, telephone survey research has troubles identifying younger voters, African Americans, and Latinos. And all of those groups are overwhelmingly Democrat. And when you miss them, as a partisan pollster, you're missing a very important Democrat dynamic. And so how a pollster develops a likely voter model, how we weight and interview those audiences, whether or not there's really enough cell phone interviewing going on. All of those things are things that have to be done, are a challenge to our industry and are things that have to be done differently. And our firm is doing a massive internal project, for example, where we've taken all of our interviews from August, well, post-Labor Day to Election Day. We've merged them all that were done for the Romney and other campaigns in the state. We're now matching them back to voter files so that we can identify who did vote that we did not think was going to vote, and who did not vote we thought was going to. So we can look at the gaps between our own model and that outcome. But there's, and we can talk more about this, I don't want to go on and on, but there's a series of things that I think that we have learned and are going to be doing aggressively differently to kind of learn from what happened in 2012. The last point, and this is something that affects all of us in this room, not just pollsters, is we all, I think, have to realize how much our life has been changed by the money in politics. Meaning that for NBC Wall Street Journal, we ask a question, hey, have you been contacted by a campaign? And in 2004, that was 30% of the country. In 2012, 70% of the people in swing states said they had been personally contacted, and that was with 2.5 weeks left. In other words, the years and generations of modeling that have been done were never done in a world where we were literally spending billions of dollars and there was that volume of personal contact. And I think that the scope and volume of campaigns has, and by the way, the ease of access to vote through mail are two factors that make obsolete a lot of what's been done in terms of the historic generation of likely voter models that have been used. And I think that the scope of the campaigns and the ease of voting are two factors that render a lot of historic analog by likely voter models under challenge and need to be altered. So that's, I mean, that's a hopefully a quick snapshot, but something we can talk about at length here this morning.
Great. By the way, one of the things I have asked the group to do is to keep their comments to about 10, 12 minutes so that we can leave about half the time we have for questions, because as pollsters, we live off the questions. And I actually think the best you're going to get is you asking the questions and us being able to answer. Joel, you wrote in an op-ed in the New York Times that the 2012 election was not ultimately about demographics, but was about values and vision. How did the Obama campaign use the research, either quantitative or qualitative, to understand and tap into those values amongst voters?
Yeah. Well, you know, the starting point for us in 2011, when we started to think about the campaign, not just what was going on in the inside the Beltway and policy debates that were going on, our starting point was some things we had learned right from the beginning, which is that voters believed something extraordinary had taken place in America. And a lot of the work we had done for labor unions, even going back to 2005, were kind of signaling that to us, that working and middle class Americans were seeing things changing in ways that troubled them. It wasn't so much that they just thought that the rules that they had lived by and worked by had been replaced by some new set of rules. They actually didn't think there were a set of rules that they could use as guideposts for their own economic lives, for their children. And so that was unsettling to them. What we did in early 2011, and the great thing about the Obama campaign, both Obama campaigns, was the folks at the head of the campaign always said to the research people, be as creative as you want, come to us with new ideas. And we proposed and did a project that we called loosely the Ethnography Project. We weren't going into people's homes, but it was an ethno-journaling project. And we realized that for all the research we'd done from 2007, we never really had a deep dive, non-political conversation with the swing voters we were going to have to influence about their economic lives. And even our focus groups, where we used them very developmentally, they're 90 minutes, you've got 8 people, you're getting a smattering of indication. We designed a project where over a 16-day period, 6 times, we had 100 swing voters come to a website we hosted, and each night they would answer 8 to 10 questions that were designed in a specific way and about a specific topic. So on a given night, we might probe only on their views on community, We might probe only on their feelings about the future. We might probe only on the workplace. And when I say 8 to 10 questions, we didn't use traditional open-ended questions. We were purposefully building the questions the way journalists would. I was a former journalist, as Ed mentioned. We anticipated what all the follow-up questions were you would want to ask. And this is obviously for pollsters and focus groups an unconventional approach. Usually ask one question, but we wanted them to answer very deeply and think deeply about what we were putting in front of them. So if we said, when was the last time you were treated unfairly in the workplace, and describe that incident for us, we didn't stop there. There were 5 follow-up questions to that alone. What specifically happened? What made you feel you were treated unfairly in that situation? How was that different or similar to other ways you'd been treated in the workplace recently? What were your expectations for how you should have been treated in that situation? We asked them questions about their economic lives, how they were spending, why they were making decisions not to go to the movies or not to go on vacation or save cash instead of using a credit card. We went into these 6 nights with that kind of data. At the end of that process, we had 100 people. We had 1,400 pages of transcripts. Each night, on average, people were spending an hour answering our questions. We could analyze that data by the individual respondent and by the subject area. And that gave us a great insight into how the American people in early 2011 had really recalibrated their mindset about their economic lives and what were the real flashpoints for them. We understood the ways in which they thought their basic sense of fairness had been eroded, and how and in what ways they felt the deck was stacked against working people like them and in favor of those who were very wealthier at the top. We understood that what they were really hungry for was a sense of reciprocity, that somebody had their back, that if they had been a loyal employee and worked for a company for 20 years, they understood they weren't going to get big raises because of the crisis we had gone through. They just wanted someone to treat them fairly and not give them a 3-cent an hour raise if they had been good employees all the way through. We learned that they, and this really helped us because I think when you look back on this campaign, we took on the theory of Reaganomics, and one of the things we learned early on was that people had a very a deep sense for durability in the economy. They had lived through an internet bubble, a housing bubble, now a mortgage bubble that was eroding their trust in the system and the players who they felt were really in control of the financial world around them. And that enabled us to then go test a lot of these things quantitatively, where we really looked at, we try to create fault lines in our data. We ask long, nuanced batteries of attitudinal questions that reflect those values and attitudes that we learn qualitatively, and then we analyze them based on the top box intensity around them, because we're really trying to figure out what is shaping the psychology around the issue of the category that we're focusing on. So out of that qualitative work and then tested quantitatively, we knew, for example, that over 45% of the people strongly agreed with the statement that we can't cut our way to prosperity. Now that seems like a pretty simple proposition, but for us it opened up a whole pathway to develop a way of talking about spending and the deficit that allowed a Democrat, President Obama, to lean into an issue that had historically been a weakness for us. And so we did that for both their immediate sense of the economy. We understood that they believed this crisis wasn't created overnight and wouldn't be solved overnight. We tested that out quantitatively. We were quite surprised by that. We knew that when we started in 2008 that we asked the question, again, we create different questions that aren't typical. We asked people how long did they think it would take America to recover from the economic crisis and get back on track, not fully recover, get back on track. And in late 2008, people said 5 years. When we went back in 2011, people said 2 years. The majority said 2 years. So we understood that their framework and their thinking about the situation that we were in was different. We understood what they thought the causes and how those were different. And then as we went forward, we were able to marry that up with a set of policies, set of values that we reiterated over and over again in the campaign.
Very good. If I could just ask a follow-up question.
Sure.
Very often when we look at polling from a traditional definition, we throw around the term middle class.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at it from a self-definition, it's about 75% of the electorate. If you look at it from a standpoint of an economic, in a very broad economic definition of 50,000 to 250,000, is about 75%. What were you doing to break that down? To
Great question, Ed. And I think this relates also somewhat to Bill's point about some of the likely voter questions. We actually never used just the simple self-ID. We created a longer gradation on the scale. We wanted to know whether people considered themselves upper middle class, lower middle class. We had about a 7-point range on self-ID, but we used 3 variables to decide where middle class was. We used their self-identification, we overlaid that with their income levels and where the median incomes were, and then we also included education level. And we actually came up with middle class typically being between 47 and 52%, poll after poll, using that dynamic. And I think that goes to the point about accuracy of polling generally. You've got to rethink the traditional questions you've been asking. We're functioning in a different world. You know, a lot of the Gallup's likely voter questions still ask people, do you know where you vote? Well, you know, in the old days, that was a good question because the only way you knew where to vote is if you knew where to vote. You couldn't call up the Board of Elections. Either they sent you a piece of mail, and if you kept it, you knew. Well, when I saw Gallup's likely voter samples, I did a very informal focus group in our office in New York where we have a lot of young people, and I said, do you know where you're going to vote in a week? And they said, no. And I said, well, are you all voting? They said, yes. I said, well, how are you going to vote? And they took out their smartphones. They said, the Board of Elections has it. I put in my address, and it tells me where to go vote. So you just have to rethink how you ask questions. That middle class one is one where we said, we can't just rely on one metric. Let's take 3 that seem to make sense, put them together, and looked at it over a period of time. And after 3 or 4 polls, we said this is consistently coming in where the middle class should come in.
Scott, and Bill kind of alluded to this. I'm playing in both worlds with the Wall Street Journal NBC. Public pollsters do have somewhat of a different mission than campaign pollsters. What are your thoughts on the performance of the public pollsters in the 2012?
I will give 2 answers to that. I think public pollsters and public polling did very well, and they did fairly well. When you think about what public polls are supposed to do, their mission is different from what the campaign pollsters do. That's obvious. We're supposed to explain to the public what's happening and why it's happening. On the question of explaining why the election was going the way it was, I will give public pollsters some pretty good marks. I mean, maybe I'm speaking for myself here, but I think the public pollsters generally told a good story about why voters were making the decisions that they were making. There was a lot of emphasis after the election using the exit polls on demographics, but I agree with Joel that actually the story wasn't so much in the demographics as in the values and in the mindset of the public. We were able to document fairly early on that the economy, while it was a very serious problem in everybody's mind, was not wholly owned by the president. That sort of violated the assumption that a lot of people went into it, that the president had to own the economy and that it was going to be his downfall. But I think we discovered fairly early that that wasn't the case. Yes, he got some responsibility for it, but even an exit poll question demonstrated that a significant number of people felt that George W. Bush still owned the economy, which seemed odd to people, but is understandable taken in the broad view. So in telling the story of why the election went the way it did, I think the public polls made a good contribution. And of course, historically, it's been important for there to be an independent interpretation of the election because candidates naturally want to explain the way things go in ways that are serving their own interests. And so the public pollsters have a responsibility to offer an alternative version of reality. In terms of the question of what happened in the campaign, I don't think the public polls did as well. And there are 2 ways in which we can view that. One of them is about the bottom line and how the election turned out. And on that, I do think that the public polls did pretty well with the qualification. In terms of the campaign dynamics, I don't think the public polls did a particularly good job, and I would include our own polling in that, and I'll explain. In terms of the bottom line, I think, we've all become addicts of the poll aggregators, and we know that ultimately the poll aggregators did a very good job using the public polls to make forecasts state by state and to correctly predict the outcome of the election. When you look at the aggregated public polls, though, you do see that while the bottom line was right, the margin tended to be wrong. There was a Republican bias in the public polling of a few percentage points. Now, when I use the term bias, I think everyone understands I'm not talking about consciously putting the thumb on the scale. It's just a consistent error, an error in a consistent direction. Most of the public polling underestimated the size of the Obama margin, whether we're talking about the states or the national margin of victory. Now, there are a number of reasons why that might have been. We've talked a little bit about the likely voter models. I don't think the likely voter models did a very good job this past cycle, partly for the reason that Joel suggested, that there are some archaic items in the typical likely voter scale. Ours is actually very close to the Gallup one because the former president of the Pew Research Center, Andy Kohut, learned his craft with Paul Perry and with George Gallup, and was president of the Gallup organization and brought many of the approaches and the techniques of Gallup to our organization. And we really puzzled over that question and what it was doing, what its properties were likely to be. But I don't think in general likely voter questions worked very well, particularly for predicting the behavior of the core democratic groups like Latinos, African Americans, and young people. We also know that many polls, not all of them, but many polls suffered from a lack of coverage of the cell phone population. Most pollsters were beginning to include cell phones, but it isn't enough just to have a few cell phones in your sample. That doesn't fix the problem of missing the kinds of people that tend to be dependent upon a cell phone or solely have cell phone service. And so those things led to, I think, some underestimation of the Obama margin. The situation actually may be a little worse than people remember it, because the fact is that after the election was over, in the few days immediately following, most of the polling critics did their postmortems and put their charts together. But the Obama margin actually expanded by a point or point and a half after the first several days following the election. And so, many of the judgments that we might have in our mind from remembering that period are actually off by another point or 2 points because of the counting of the votes that occurred. Now, in the defense of the public pollsters and maybe the campaign pollsters as well, I think there's some evidence, I'd be interested to know if the internal campaign polls reflected this, that there actually was a bit of an uptick in the Obama numbers in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, that may have moved the needle a point. Maybe it accounted for a little bit of the mismatch, since most pollsters were out of the field and reporting on their polls before the full impact of the aftermath of the hurricane was felt. But in general, I think that the polls did okay. They predicted the right winner in most instances, but they still didn't quite nail it. Now, finally, on the question of the campaign dynamics, I think the polls did not do a great job, and again, I include our own in that. We saw a tremendous amount of fluctuation from poll to poll, much more than we have seen in previous campaign cycles. The fluctuations seem to be reflecting differential non-response among people either on the Democratic side or the Republican side. And I think the effect of that was to exaggerate movement in the campaign. Now, partisan pollsters, campaign pollsters, have traditionally used modeling, particularly using party affiliation or other variables, to try to tamp down that variability and true up samples. And I think one of the interesting things that came out of the campaign, particularly from the postmortems that Bill and others, Ed, I think you wrote some about this as well, is that the modeling, the aggressive modeling of the data with assumptions about who's going to vote and about what the underlying partisan composition of the sample, didn't serve Republican pollsters particularly well in this cycle. Most of the public pollsters don't do any of that. They do they do their methods, they gather their data, and other than weighting the data to match census parameters on demographics, they don't make adjustments for things like differential non-response. And I came away from this campaign thinking that we are going to have to meet the campaign pollsters somewhere in the middle in terms of modeling. The online pollsters that are using non-probability samples are already doing that because they're starting with samples that have, have issues and are not random samples. But we as a profession probably need to take more account of information that's in voter databases and to think about the construction of the likely electorate in ways that we have not had to do before back in the era when we had response rates that were at least in double digits.
Can I jump in on one point? And I'll make it brief because it goes to the question of volatility. We do use voter lists. We did have a model. Our polling was very accurate. We also had two other buckets. I did the aggregate battleground state polling for messaging purposes. We had other pollsters, John Anzalone, Diane Feldman polling, Paul Harstedt state by state and tracking there. We also had our analytics teams doing high volume polls on their modeling side, and they would report out state numbers as well. We would take their polls when we got their data back and aggregate them in proportion to our battleground model over the last 5 or 6 months of the campaign, and we're all using our own methodologies. We weren't locked into one methodology. If somebody wanted to stratify a sample, that's fine. If another pollster in Colorado wanted to weigh it on the back end, that was fine. So using different methodologies, our polling in 3 different buckets aggregated, and the state pollsters and the analytics guys were always within a point of our aggregated polling. Second point, this was not a volatile electorate, and this goes to the public polling largely where people think it was bouncing around a lot. We can talk about whether it did or not. From September 4th through the election, our lead was 3 or 4 points in the battleground states in every poll we did, except after the 47% episode, when our lead went to 7 points, where Republicans, soft Republicans, left Obama. We reported right away, we're not staying at 7, these folks are gonna come back. 3 or 4 points, basically 50-46 or 49-46. Pretty darn close to where we ended up from September 4th through the end of the election, including the post-debate period, including Sandy, and we did poll on Monday night before the election on my own dime because the campaign calls it vanity polling. But after New Hampshire in 2008, I said I'm never not polling on the last night before an election again. So the notion that there was all this volatility was never borne out in our polling. And I think you know from some of our conversations and some of the postmortems we've done that I do think you're right that the public pollsters will have to meet in the middle. But I think that's a great misperception. The electorate was actually more static than we ever saw before, more locked in, right at the time after the Republican convention. And so I do think the public pollsters do have to figure out how to get closer to the kind of modeling the campaign pollsters are doing.
If I could, and I would agree with that. I saw the same thing in terms of the battleground. We were very consistent in terms of going through. I'm going to pose 2 kind of questions to all 3 of you, and then we'll open it up to the audience. One is that one of the things kind of missing in the discussion of predicting the election is other variances that had an effect, not Sandy, but in this case, and I asked Joel this question before, is that it is now infamous, the discussion of not only the supreme advantage the Obama campaign had on how they messaged down to groups of voters, identified those voters, and then turned out those voters, versus a collapse in many cases, especially in some of the battleground states, a collapse of the get out the vote operation on the part of the Romney campaign. How much do you account for that being a part of the numbers perhaps being right, but the margin not being right, as opposed to the numbers being wrong from the beginning in terms of the margin?
Very briefly, our margins were right. I mean, our last poll and our last forecast on Monday night was roughly 51-47. Our target goal as a campaign was to get to 51% of vote. Now, I'm working with the campaign that's doing that get out the vote operation. Does that contribute to us, hitting the model? Yeah. But we also were pretty conservative in our polling. In other words, there were times where we felt you know, if we wanted to be conservative about young voter turnout, which in some states was a little more variable than others, we would be more conservative in our model. Even if it meant in our raw data we were getting 18%, which is what we thought the young vote would be. You know, if we kept it weighted to 17 or 16, if the analytics guys said it appeared to be more conservative, but that was only going to weigh in our favor. If more young people voted, it would help us. So we were pretty accurate in the modeling, and I think pretty accurate in the polling. Get out the vote helps. I can't quantify how much, but certainly in some states it definitely made a difference. I think when you look at Ohio, Florida, I think and you know, less so in Virginia this time because our margin was bigger, but if you think of those 3 states as the ones that have been the epicenter of the battlegrounds, definitely helped in 2 of those 3.
Bill?
Well, this gets to complicated stuff. One of the things that I think, again, polling has to look at is there's a known figure called citizens of voting age population. And one of the reasons turnout tends to go up cycle to cycle is, guess what? Our country is growing. And the citizens of voting population number goes up every 4 years. But guess who's comprising that gain? That gain is almost all people aging in the electorate, 18 to 29-year-olds, and the new wave of especially young Latino kids, but also our kind of new naturalized citizens. So what I presumed, and again, if you look at ABC, you look at ABC, you look at NBC Wall Street Journal, you look at Pew, you look at a lot of the available public polling, and they were showing 18 to 29-year-olds and Latinos at the same or lower margin than 4 years, because self-described interest amongst Latinos and 18 to 29-year-olds was catastrophically lower than 4 years ago. And so there's a presumed relationship between self-described interest in voting. And so what I presumed was, look, if Obama was going to win by that margin, it would mean that, to me, that we'd have raw votes over 131 million. In other words, he was going to expand the electorate because Latino and younger voters were going to turn out in larger numbers as part of a larger electorate because the base was bigger. Now, what happened is that we have 2 or 3 million less voters at the end. We have about 128 to 131 million. So we have 3 million less voters, and the exit polls tell us that Latinos and 18 to 29-year-olds are higher than 4 years ago. So that's the reason I think that things have to be done different. But I mean, one of the things you have to look at is why, in fact, are there missing white voters in Ohio? Or why is there a whole chunk of white voters who were presumed to vote who didn't vote? And some of that can be tactical, some of it can be message, some of it's just a weak attachment to Romney. But that's part of what we're going to answer by just finding who those people are and going to go talk to them. But this is the other critique I would make of partisan pollster. And again, I'm making it charitably because I am one. But let's go through a little bit of math to tell you what I think part of what goes wrong in partisan polling is we know that in most polls you have adults, okay? You call an adult on the phone, 80% of them say they're going to register to vote. And so if you take 80% who are going to say who are registered, and then you take about 80% of them as being likely to vote in presidential year, that's 64% of adults. And so, example, Pew, when you read all their internal stuff, you know, in their appendixes, they rightly say, look, here's one of the things we know as academics, that people participating in a poll are already much more likely to be voters than anybody who won't participate. And so they correctly, I believe, because I do the same thing, so I think it's correct, they set the total likely voter model at around a few points above the actual turnout of citizens voting age population. But here's what happens in partisan polls. So at NBC Wall Street Journal, guess what? We set up our likely voter number to be about, 62, 64% of adults. So we take our registered voters and we take somewhere like about 75 to 82%. It floats every poll, but it's calibrated to a known number. And that's the likely voter. And that's the number we use. What happens in campaigns is they say, well, let's look at, here's our voter model, here's the people interviewed. Let's look at the people who are the most interested to vote. Let's look at people who are tens on the self-described interest. Let's look at people who have all these criteria. And what they're doing is they're taking a 64% turnout and then they're compressing it to about 49% of adults because they're looking at a fraction of their own likely voters they've interviewed. And that's garbage Because guess what? You don't get a weighted vote if you're jumping up and down versus if you if you get dragged to the polls. And
Did you say partisan pollsters do that?
I'm saying, let me correct myself. Many Republican partisan pollsters
Okay.
are doing that. Okay.
I just wanted to make sure.
Okay. So, but the point is, they're saying they're taking what ought to be their whole sample, and that sample is the likely voter, and then they're looking at subsets of that, and that subsets of that project to a turnout that's massively too low. And that subset, because of the Republican intensity of this election, gave you a distorted view of what was going to happen. And number two, what I am saying is that, and I said, I'm not saying we're asking the wrong questions, we may not be asking the right questions. Another hint is when you ask people in NBC Wall Street Journal how they've been contacted. Amongst 18 to 29-year-olds, the Obama campaign had a 28, almost 35-point advantage in terms of social media contact. Social media is a mechanism where you can contact your friends and neighbors and say, please go vote, here's why it's important. And it's not, and so the point is, we, meaning Public Opinion Strategies, in Virginia, which we're doing, we'll be adding a set of new questions on our own dime, because we have to, in my mind, expand the number of questions we're asking about what influences your vote. And I think one of them has to be social media contact, an appeal by, have you been asked by a friend or family member to vote? That there has to be, in other words, that because of mail, because of absentee voting, because you no longer have to go stand in line, it's easy to vote. That the amount of work that it requires for somebody to wake up and decide to go vote or how to vote is so much easier, that those old battery of questions need to be replaced by some set of new questions that, sure, we should look at campaign interest, we should look at, we should look at all that stuff, but it should be amended and it should be expanded. And so what we'll do is, again, we're writing that set of questions, we'll be testing it in a special election and in Virginia, and then we'll be doing we'll be doing the same thing. We'll be going back to actual vote history to see how well those new questions allow us to understand this. One quick thing, though, Joe, before you, but the other thing I'd like to say is the other thing that's in the Pew Appendix that is right is the other thing that people need to understand about pollsters is that when you do a likely voter poll and you show a likely voter for a pollster isn't, are we 100% sure all of these people are going to vote? A likely voter model means, have we represented an electorate that represents the composition of the electorate? And that's the other thing that I think is not well understood about what's meant by a likely voter pool, which is we're not trying to say, oh, we know for sure that every single person in this poll is going to vote and these people won't. That we're going to say, is this the right composition of the electorate? And then just one final thing I looked at, because again, NBC Wall Street Journal is just such a fabulous database. The other thing I looked at is we've been interviewing since August. We had thousands of folks. So we had, 1,600, 1,800 that were considered non-likely voters, that were registered non-likely voters. One of the impressions that I have is the influence of intensity. And I asked this question. Let me take my non-likely voters, and then I want to find people who have these criteria. They're very favorable to one candidate, very unfavorable to the other. That's criteria one. Criteria two is they're definitely saying they vote for a candidate, and number three is they're a hard partisan. And how many of those people did I leave sitting in a likely voter pool that had that much intensity about this election? Now, in some ways you can say, well, that wasn't awful. It would have added 1% more to the vote, but Obama would have been 0.6 further ahead. Now, our poll the last day had Obama at 1.4, and so it aggregated to 1. But if our poll had added that 0.6%, it would have been 2. No, that's not a big thing, but I would have felt a hell of a lot better at 2 than I did at 1 in terms of a final margin. And my point about non-likely voters is this premise. If you have very favorable feelings for Obama, very unfavorable for Romney, and you say you're definitely voting for Obama and you're a definite partisan, I don't think I should have let them sit in an unlikely voter. That kind of extra check about that level of intensity is the kind of thing that I haven't looked at before that is part of the rethinking I'm doing about what we do and how to do it better.
And your response is very good, and it's kind of where I was getting at on my question, is that on one hand, you sample to the correct electorate. On the other hand, if you do a better job on getting out the vote, that impacts what the electorate is. And so there is a balance between the two that you have to look at in the polling.
There is, Ed, but you got to think of the process here. The process here, in terms of get out the vote, is to, for example, our first polling created a model in early 2011 that said we have to get to 51% of the vote. Here are the groups that we have to move to get there.
Exactly.
And the get out the vote model is then targeting those groups coming from the universe that we created, and the model that we used in our benchmark poll in September 2011. We hit 51% as a target, not just because 50 plus 1 is how you win, but we looked at our performance in 2008. We looked at which demographic groups were part of our coalition where we were weaker in August and September of 2011, saw where our growth opportunities were, our lowest hanging fruit. And given that President Obama was only like the third Democrat in history to get 53% or more of the vote, we felt 51% in what would be a tough year would be a reasonable target. So we started with a model that happened to be right. The get out the vote worked in tandem with us. But the model on the front end was right as well.
And the point being is that as political pollsters, using polling as a tool to deliver your campaign, not to predict what's going to happen and sit back on it. Second question I have for the three of you, and I'll let you kind of jump in on the first question, is Bill wrote a very good article right after the election, kind of calling attention to what you mentioned, which was everyone was jumping in and making assumptions about the election based on what they were seeing on the early numbers, when in fact it was a good week before the full numbers were in, and you could see it perhaps was a drop-off of 2.5, 3 million in the raw vote from 4 years earlier, but it wasn't the 6, 7 million that people were talking about right after the election. But one of the other things you have out there is, and with you doing the exit polling so much and being involved in that, a key question may be directed at you first, is that very often we kind of look at the exit polling somewhat suspect in the beginning, and then it becomes the holy grail as we move away from the election. We're now looking at data that is showing in the 26 states, for example, where you have age, that the exit polling has understated the actual vote of seniors by about 5%. And if you take all the unidentified by age and throw them into the younger category, you still don't reach the younger category. How much, and it appears like the error factor goes up based on how much of the vote was early vote. And so we're mixing two methodologies. We're mixing the traditional exit polling methodology and on the early vote using a different methodology on survey research. How concerned are you that we are moving, as we use so much the exit polling, to look at our models for the next year? How concerned are you that they are somewhat off?
Well, let me stress that I'm speaking as a political observer and not as an NBC employee. I've worked for NBC for a long time, but these opinions are my own. Exit polls, as you describe them, are not the holy grail. They do tend to take on that status because they have some concreteness. They obviously are wonderful tools for us to be able to understand the outcome of the election, but they're not perfect. They're polls. And we know that exit polls have had some serious challenges. One of them that you mentioned, which is the rising percentage of voters who vote early. The exit polls did a better job this year than they did 4 years ago in trying to capture that. They included telephone surveys, including cell phones, in the states where the early vote represented a significant percentage, as well as nationally. And that, I think, has improved them. But fundamentally, they are a different mode. It's a telephone mode as opposed to a in-person self-administered questionnaire as the actual exit poll question is. And then exit polls done in person tend to have some non-response issues, some non-response bias issues. This is something that the exit polls can estimate on the fly in the evening when the vote is coming in by comparing the actual vote in a precinct with the voters who were interviewed in that precinct. But early in the evening, they don't know that because they don't have vote. Now, in the end, they can correct that bias because they know what the precinct vote was, they know what the state vote was, and they can weight the data to that. Although, this cycle, they ended up weighting the data to a 2 percentage point Obama margin at the national level and froze it, and that's what the exit polls say. If you go on the network sites and look at the exit polls, they show that Obama won the election by 2 points. He won the election by 4 points. So there's that issue, but the other issue is that if the non-response is correlated with different voter characteristics such as age or race, then even the correction of the data to match the vote doesn't fix that problem, and so the compositional numbers are wrong. And you know, one of the things that my boss at NBC over many years stressed to us as analysts not to do is to put too much weight on the composition of the electorate on election night. The reporters may want to come and say, oh wow, we see that the percentage of Hispanics in the poll is a point higher than it was 4 years ago. Wow, that means Hispanic turnout is higher. No, please don't do that because that could be an artifact of the sampling that was done and where Spanish language questionnaires were made available to voters and a host of other things, as well as simply the differential willingness of groups to take the exit polls. So I don't want to undermine the exit polls and the fact that they are important and valuable tools, and we've written a lot out of them, but they aren't perfect, they have flaws, and they're facing more challenges today than ever before, just like all of our other kinds of polls.
Joel? Bill?
I know they want to do questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, any questions? Where can we start? We're having trouble seeing you out there.
Hi, there's been so much talk about Hispanic voters and some of the other demographics, but 20% of Americans have disabilities. That's 50 million Americans, and 70% of Americans with disabilities don't have jobs. Yet neither of the presidential candidates attended an invitation by 200 different disability groups to address disability issues. There was not one speech by either major candidate on disability issues. So I gotta think, maybe you guys aren't asking in the crosstabs or your demographics or doing focus groups what Americans with disabilities, which is again 50 million Americans, want in leaders, or are you, and you're finding that those issues don't impact them? So again, the question is, are you asking in your demographics, do you have a disability, or do you have a family member with a disability, and are you doing focus groups with those groups?
I have not done that, not for our political polling. I've done it for some of our disease and chronic disease groups and some other stuff we've done, but I've not done it in our traditional political polling.
We've added it into demographics when we're polling on specific issues related to people and families with disabilities, because you want to be able to look at that population. We don't keep them in. We don't keep that in the demographics in every poll.
What about in the pew and any of your...
We've asked the question in our demographics in the past. We didn't do it this past fall. I think that there's an argument for doing it, but one of the analytical challenges is that the group, while it is, as you say, very large, is a very heterogeneous group of people with a variety of different circumstances. Some of them kind of disabilities that might come to our mind when we think about people, who have, use wheelchairs or have prostheses or have vision problems or something. But the variety of disabilities is so great that we haven't found a good way to make analytical use of it, other than to say these are people who have difficulty with the everyday activities of life, either work or work around the house, and it is a very large group.
One other just pertinent point, which is George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disability Act, and there was an argument made that this would have a a political advantage. And so there, I did some work in that. This is a long time ago. So, and by the way, that means it could have easily changed. Maybe there's a political quotient today, but we did some work trying to demonstrate or see if Mr. Bush would get any advantage as a consequence of his signing the Americans with Disability Act. And in fact, that didn't exist in the data at the time. But again, that's 20 years or whatever it was ago. But that's the one time that I had looked specifically at a political overlay around this issue because of Mr. Bush signing that initial legislation.
Other questions?
Yeah, my question is for Scott. You mentioned that just adding a few cell phones into your sample isn't sufficient to reach kind of the younger generation, the Latinos, those who are likely to vote but not reachable by traditional landline phones. What percentage of a sample would you say is sufficient to represent that population?
I don't think there's a single number that I could use. Starting in January of this year, are now 50-50 cell phone and landline. That still causes us to fall below the percentage of the population that we think is cell phone only. That number we estimate to be 36 or 37% right now. If we do half of our interviews on cell phones, and we get about 25% of our total sample who are cell phone only. Now, because young people don't turn out at the rate that older voters do, and because Latinos don't turn out at the rate that other voters do, you're penalized a little less in political polling for not quite hitting the population mark. But we were doing 40% last fall, and we think that probably wasn't quite high enough. We're at 50% now. But that's a huge burden, given that that cell phone interviews, at least with the contractors that we use, tend to cost 1.5 to 2 times as much per interview as a landline interview.
I'm going to put a slightly dissenting hypothesis on the table for everybody. And we spot check things along the way. We've got, in fact, I saw my colleague Pete Brodnitz, great pollster, won the Kane race in Virginia, again, is sitting in the back of the room. We did a test during the campaign where we did traditional phone polling the way we do it, robocalls, internet polling. With the disadvantage of the internet or the robocalls is just you have to do more weighting, but if you have the right model, you could actually get those 3 results aligned. I want to suggest that you're obsessing about cell phones when that is not the differentiating factor when people vote. There are other characteristics, their race, their age, their gender, their party affiliation or identification, that are actually much more relevant than how they're going to vote and whether they're going to vote than whether or not they have a cell phone or not. And if you do parallel tests, you can find, which we do because we spot check this all the time to make sure that we understand which variables are really driving the different political attitudes. And it's not the cell phones. And so if you obsess about the cell phones, you may miss something else. Make sure you get the model of the electorate right based on other characteristics, and you'll get it right. And if your cell phone number is going to be 17% in one poll or 24 in another poll, you'll get it right if you have the model right based on other characteristics that do drive political attitudes.
Let me respond on that just for a second. We've done those parallel tests. In other words, we take our landline interviews and we weight them as if we didn't even have a cell phone sample. And so we see that. We see that in terms of your bottom line prediction, the size of the bias is relatively modest. And that's without any of the other kind of modeling that we might do that would improve the sample. The problem is if we don't include cell phones and our sample sizes are not large, we simply don't have enough people in certain categories, particularly 18 to 29, to be able to describe them. In other words, we don't get the case count to be able to characterize them, which is one of our missions, apart from accurately predicting the outcome of the election. And so that's really more the motivation for us even than the bottom line, because we've been doing those parallel tests, and I know what you mean.
Bill?
Well, again, I have a somewhat different view because NBC Wall Street Journal, we have 13,000 interviews a year. We can take and do parallel, here's this age group with lines, this age group with cell phones, we do see a difference. Here's some of the factors. Look, so Obama in the exit polls won cell phones by 11 points. He lost landline people in the initial interviews by 2. If you do 20% cells in a national sample versus the 33% in the exit poll, that's a net 2-point difference, and you're missing the race by 2 points. Let me talk about a few things. So, for example, at NBC Wall Street Journal, we screen for cell phone only, and we are committed to doing the CDC number. Because for now, 4 straight cycles, the exit poll and the CDC household number have been very close. But in I'll say Republican partisan polling, a few things are going wrong. One, they have been and they are doing too few cell phones, and they're trying to weight them up. Or here's the other thing that I've seen go wrong too often in some Republican polls, which is their raw interviews are like 18 to 22% under 45, and they're trying to weight them to 45%. You are doing an injustice in a survey if you think you can take 20% of your interviews and weight them at 40, 45%. And so the amount of money that it requires to do quota sampling, which we can do nationally for NBC, but to do quota sampling in a campaign so that you in a real campaign are getting large enough numbers of these minority and younger voters is incredibly expensive. I think these is, again, we talk about a hard lesson learned by a party, and in the RNC report it talks about this, that these are methodological shortcuts that have had impact now on the ability of these numbers to be used. Now, the other thing to speak well for the Democrats is they put together a very large one central system where they are doing registered voters, but they have tons of information to allow them to project and build a model. The Republicans don't do that, and I think we are somewhat behind in that regard. It's, again, something the national party committees are starting now. But so this is why the Democrats always look surprised. It's because they are literally using right now an entire different system of polling than Republicans are using. And it's working well for them. And Republicans is one more area where Republicans, I think, are at this point catching up.
That raises a question. The amount spent on polling and campaigns is kind of like foreign aid. It's always perceived to be much more than what it actually is. Traditionally,
I'm glad to hear a Republican say that about foreign aid, Ed.
Traditionally, it's between 3 and 5% of the budget. Now, the larger the budget gets, the smaller that becomes.
Right.
But with what we are doing as pollsters to try to stay in front of all the problems are presented out there, how much do you see that growing as a percent of the campaign budget?
I just talked to a candidate who's going to be running a major statewide race in 2014, and I still said, look, you can expect in a state like yours that your research budget, polling, and focus groups would be about 5% of your budget up to about a $15 million campaign. Then the fact that you raise and spend more money, that percent is going to go down. And it will, but that's about at the level. And the reason it's going to, you'll keep spending more after that, but it'll go down is because you'll do more ad testing. Mm-hmm. You'll do, a little more tracking because you'll have the wherewithal. But the truth is that your basic messaging and strategic work that you need to do is going to be done within that, $750,000 on that $15 million campaign. Presidential campaign, I think both campaigns spent about $1 billion. I could tell you that the polling and research budget was pretty low out of that relative to what was spent, even probably lower than your 3% number for sure.
Yeah, there was, yes. I know we want to have more questions. I think that's right. I think that on the Romney campaign, I was only my partner did it. I didn't do the work, but it is closer to, at $1 billion, it's probably closer to 1.5%.
Next question.
Yeah, hi. So, Joel, you had mentioned the Gallup question that on turnout that you thought wasn't very good. So I'm wondering what are better examples of questions that predict turnout or likely voters?
Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, remember that, as Bill pointed out, we have the advantage of we're working with a voter list, and in most of the states we have some degree of vote history as well as and that could include vote history in a primary, so you have some sense of things. Look, and I spoke about Gallup publicly when they had a battleground state poll in USA Today showing that we were winning among men and losing among women. And I said, well, you know, one of the first lessons I learned in polling is if a number looks wrong, it probably is. Not definitely is, but probably is, and you ought to tear apart the data to make sure. We were never ahead among men and behind among women in the battleground states, right? It defied logic. Look, I just think they had a set of questions that when you go back and look at them, and from time to time in the fall, we put people's questions in our polling with our likely voter sample. And with a couple of the outlets that we did this with, we found out that their likely voter screens were excluding 20% of the people that we were qualifying as voters in our screen. Now, I'm not going to tell you precisely our screen, because frankly, our modeling was pretty good, and I, you know, respectfully just don't want to publicize it here for the rest of the world. But the fact of the matter is those 20% skewed towards Obama voters. And not only that, but the likely voter screens from those two entities, different questions, but similar patterns, screened out 20% of the people who told us they'd already voted. And those people also skewed towards Obama in the early voting. So there was something fundamentally wrong. There are lots of ways to check it. Look, one of the key things in polling, whether you're doing it at Pew, whether you're doing it on a campaign, is constantly challenge the assumptions you've made, challenge the way you think about it, challenge, are you asking the right question? You got to try and explain the phenomena that seems contradictory or unexplainable, and sometimes that means do a test with some different questions. You know, I just think they had many. What I said publicly was, because they asked about whether they moved, is it the first time you're voting at this polling place, do you know where you're voting, that their likely voter model was basically biased against urban voters because they move more frequently. It was biased against renters because they move more frequently, and it was biased against young people because they move more frequently. Well, urban renters and younger people, there's some overlap there, but they tend to be Obama voters. And I think that's why their model was so off. And it's not the first time it's been off, by the way.
I would also add, and this is something you see after the fact, but I know Neil has talked a great deal about kind of questioning why the drop-off of intensity of Republicans, and some of the people came forward and said it was because of Sandy and other things, other factors that were out there. But if you look at one of the key things we've always used to kind of predict the likely voter, which is looking at the intensity to vote, likelihood to vote, it went, in our polling, it went from +8 Republican 4 weeks out to +10 Republican 3 weeks out to +4 Republican 2 weeks out to +2 Republican in the last week. What was happening in our data, and you don't, it goes back to challenging assumptions, is that when someone says they have already voted, we take them out of the likely voter question and put them into an already voted. And so what we were seeing, without recognizing what was happening, is that in fact where Republicans were actually claiming that the Democrats were cannibalizing their easy voters, it was Republicans that were cannibalizing their early voters, which in fact meant that when our get out the vote operation collapsed on election day, we weren't turning out our less likely voters. And so there was kind of a double whammy in the numbers that was very self-evident that makes the models look wrong, when in fact the models are actually showing us a roadmap that we were doing something that we shouldn't have been doing.
So I'll give you one insight that anybody could use, and I'll share this. And I think Bill hinted at it, and I think you're getting it at Ed. Ask people when they decided to make up their vote. And I'll use the exit polls to illustrate for you. 70% of the people in exit polls said they'd made up their mind by September 1st, before September. Obama had a 6-point lead among those people. That would give you a national advantage of 4.2 points. That would mean that Mitt Romney would have to win the remaining 30% who hadn't made up their mind by 18 points to overtake us. That's an extraordinary thing to do in the last 2 months of a campaign. And so when we looked at what was going on, we also looked, because if you made up your mind in August to vote for Obama or Romney, by the way, your interest in the race could be down. Unless you're a junkie watching Fox and MSNBC every night, why am I paying attention? I know I'm going to vote for Obama. No, I'm going to vote for Romney. I can get my information on my Twitter, on my Facebook. That's enough, and I vote. So think about when people have made up their decision and how certain they were about it, which I think Bill referenced, and you'll get a closer look at something that's going to replicate a likely voter model. It'll be a tool, it'll help.
Next question.
Thank you. Much has been talked about the Obama optimizer. I wanted to find out from your guys' perspective, we started touching on it a little bit with cell phone, but how is media consumption by voters taken into context when polling is being done. You know, where the eyeballs are at, where voters are consuming their political junkie news.
Well, I mean, we ask a media consumption question and track it when we're doing polling that's doing some ad tracking within it, because at periods of times we wanted to know what ads were people seeing and where they recalled seeing it, which is imperfect at best. But we knew certain facts from the polling about consumption of news on the internet, consumption of news on cable, which networks. Obviously, there's a lot of obvious things that go on there. But for example, which voters were watching broadcast networks more. And then the analytics team, which, you know, are the big data set, they can go even deeper into that. So we had some clues and some indication, then they go a lot deeper. The optimizer that you're talking about was even down to the individual level. It was really a breakthrough technology that people were using that really enabled us to maximize our advertising dollars in some places, to get people at really awkward times watching shows you wouldn't predict they'd be watching, but it was a narrow pool of people and you were really getting more bang for the buck.
I think Joel's got more expertise in that area than I do.
All right, let's, why don't we wrap it up? Bill, you want to start off with concluding comments?
I just think as a final comment is that, look, as Joel said powerfully, our world is changing, and a lot of what has been polling standards needs to change with it. And I think the 2012 campaign is that function. Our firm is doing a lot of stuff publicly, and we'll make it public about what we're doing. And there's been this discussion internally, like, well, do we really want to say that we're doing all this new stuff? I said, well, we'll give people a choice. Do you want to hire a pollster who's going to do the same old thing, or do you want to hire a pollster who's spending a ton of their own money to do something different? You make the call. I'd rather be the pollster that's going to spend a ton of money and do something different. But the last thing I would always remind people is the Maginot Line, is that technology is changing so rapidly that we shouldn't be trying to keep up with what happened in 2012. It's spending a ton of money to understand how fundamentally different it will be again in 2016. Because of NBC, Wall Street Journal, Pew, Joel's clients, we have incredibly well-funded clients who will do that. I will also just acknowledge, if you're a state rep or a congressional candidate, we are still in a world where now the gap between what we have to do nationally and what we can do in an individual campaign is always been enormous, but now it's potentially really substantial and a real problem, because we can't do all this for a state rep or CD race at any affordable cost.
Joel?
I'll be very brief, and I'll talk about public pollsters, if you will, the guys who do the media stuff. And I should say that both of these, Pew and NBC Wall Street Journal, are the public polls I rely on the most when I want historical data, more in-depth thinking about the electorate. However, it goes to Scott's opening point. Those folks have to do a much better job of getting the people who are paying them to not focus on the horse race headline and drive the coverage there, because if what you're really trying to do is explain what's going on, then you've got to push your clients on that side to treat the polling you're giving them better and differently, and you'll give the voters more in play, I think, a better role in the discussion than we're having right now.
Scott?
I would love to see a downplaying of the horse race. I think that's naturally going to occur, even though the public seems to be interested in it. But ultimately, our mission is to try to explain what's going on, and part of that is knowing exactly what is going on, and thus we need to have a reliable estimate of the margin. But we should be putting the vast majority of our effort into understanding the psychology of the voter, where people are coming from, and why they're making the choices they are, and that's really going to be our focus. One other thing is, though, I think that that new technology, whether we're talking about big data or we're talking about mobile devices and the way that people are going to interact with pollsters in the future, these are big challenges to traditional pollsters, but they're also big opportunities, and so I'm not pessimistic about this. I may not be a pollster for 20 more years, but I think it's going to be an exciting time to be in the business of trying to understand what people think and what they're going to do.
Thank you. And hopefully one of the things you saw from this panel is that the successful pollsters out there, whether it be the public pollsters or the campaign pollsters, The only way you keep on top is by continually changing, testing, challenging, moving. And I think that's reflected in all three comments today. So I would ask that you join me in thanking, I think, an excellent panel.
Thank you. Everybody, good to see you again.
Very nice. Enjoy the conversation.
Hang here just a second. Ed, allow me to add my thanks to all of y'all. What a great start for this great conference we have. We do appreciate you being here this early in the morning, and we appreciate you guys getting out of bed to come down and listen. We'll have a break, and the exhibit hall will be open. There's coffee and water in there, so go ahead and talk to our exhibitors and visit with one another. Thank you. Got a photographer right here. Here's a photographer right here, so we're going to get back in order there that we were, and we'll... I want to get a photograph with you too. The two of us, the left wingers.